Welcome to this explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into it. Today, we're unraveling a massive, honestly fascinating mystery, piecing together the true origins of early Israel. And to do this, we aren't just going to read old books. No, we're going to combine literal dirt dug up from the ground, ancient texts etched in stone, and some sweeping global historical events to figure out exactly how a new people emerged in the ancient Near East. So, here's our roadmap for this detective story. First, we'll track down the absolute earliest mention of Israel. Then, we'll look at a sudden, massive settlement explosion. From there, we'll zoom out to the global Bronze Age collapse, meet the incoming Philistines, and finally, wrap it all up by looking at history, story, and truth through a meta lens. Sound good? Let's get started. Part 1. The first mention of Israel. Clues in stone. We're kicking off our investigation with a massive slab of rock known as the Merneptah stele. It's an ancient Egyptian victory monument dating back to around 1209 BC. And on it, Pharaoh Merneptah is basically just bragging about all the enemies he's conquered. Hidden among those boasts is this rather chilling line: Israel is wasted, its seed is not. Now, despite the grim flexing from the pharaoh, who, like all ancient kings, absolutely never admitted to losing a battle, this is actually the very first historical, archaeological mention of Israel as a distinct people. But the real secret here? It lies in exactly how the Egyptians wrote the name Israel in hieroglyphs. See, Egyptian scribes used these specific linguistic markers called determinatives. Basically, they are unpronounced signs placed at the absolute end of a word to tell the reader what category that word belongs to. And in this case, they reveal a totally crucial, hidden clue about who these early Israelites actually were. Notice how the stele categorizes Israel compared to its neighbors. When the scribes carved the names of established city-states, like Ashkelon and Gezer, they used a determinative symbol of 3 bumps, meaning a settled people living in a city. But for Israel, they used a throwing stick alongside plural strokes. In Egyptian, this specifically denotes a foreign, unsettled nomadic group, which is amazing because it perfectly corroborates the early biblical descriptions of Israelites as a people wandering, herding flocks, and living in tents rather than behind massive city walls. Part 2. A sudden settlement explosion. Reading the dirt. Let's see how this all builds by shifting our focus from ancient texts to literal physical survey data, as we move from the late Bronze Age into what we call the Iron Age I. So, roughly the 12th and 11th centuries BC, archaeologists noticed a massive, undeniable demographic shift in the region. Towards the end of the late Bronze Age, there were barely 88 total settlements in Canaan. But suddenly, in the Iron Age I, that number explodes to a staggering 678 total settlements. And the data shows us exactly where that explosion happened: the rugged hill country. We go from just 36 settlements down there to 319. Statistically speaking, human reproduction simply doesn't work this fast. You literally cannot achieve an unnatural population spike like that just by people having larger families. So this physical evidence overwhelmingly points to a massive influx of a new group moving in and finally settling down. So what did these new folks leave behind in the dirt? Well, we start seeing a highly specific material culture popping up. They built these distinct 4-room houses with a central courtyard. We find massive collared-rim store jars that were perfect for stockpiling grain and oil. They expanded terrace farming to grow crops on the really steep hills, and they carved deep plastered cisterns right into the rock to collect rainwater. Though a quick caveat here, we do have to be careful because items like cisterns and terraces are notoriously difficult for archaeologists to date definitively. And then there's the famous pig bone debate. Archaeologists studying animal remains noticed a sharp dietary boundary. Down in the coastal plain, there was a really high presence of pig bones, but up in the hill country settlements, a distinct lack of them. So naturally, many people jump to say, aha, no pigs means Israelites. But as always, history is tricky. It turns out the local Canaanites weren't exactly big fans of eating pork either. So while animal remains offer these tantalizing clues about ethnic boundaries, they definitely require some careful interpretation.
Part 3. The Bronze Age Collapse. A World in Ruins.
To really understand why a sudden explosion of new settlements could even happen in the first place, we have to zoom way out to the macro geopolitical scene of the ancient world. For centuries during the late Bronze Age, the world was ruled by a few massive dominant superpowers: the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Babylonians. But around 1200 BC, almost all of it simply stopped. We enter a literal dark age of systemic collapse. Superpowers fall, global sea trade ends abruptly, and massive cities are either abandoned or completely destroyed. It's out of those ashes during the Iron Age that fledgling, much smaller kingdoms begin to emerge.
So, why did these invincible superpowers fall? Modern research actually points the finger largely at environmental triggers. Intense desiccation, a severe, prolonged drying out of the climate, led to devastating droughts. Imagine the entire modern global supply chain just halting. That's exactly what happened here. When the rain stopped, the crops failed. That triggered resource wars, massive political unrest, and the total destruction of brilliant civilizations like the Hittites in Anatolia and the Mycenaeans in the Aegean. Even the mighty Egyptian empire lost its grip and eventually had to retreat from the Levant.
Part 4. Arrival of the Philistines, the Sea Peoples.
Nature abhors a vacuum, right? With the great empires weakened or destroyed, migrating maritime marauders swept in, taking advantage of the absolute chaos to settle new coastal lands. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, and among them was a group known as the Peliset, who we know today as the Philistines. Now, the crucial point is how these two emerging groups compared. If you look up the word Philistine in a modern dictionary, it means someone uncultured or uncouth. But archaeology completely flips our modern assumptions. The Philistines settled on the coastal plain, right on international trade routes. They were cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and produced beautiful Aegean-style pottery. Meanwhile, the Israelites were isolated up in the rugged highlands, living a highly rural agrarian lifestyle using basic utilitarian coarsewares.
And finally, Part 5, History, Story, and Truth, the Meta-Lens.
Now that we've looked at the dirt, the stones, and the global climate, we need to shift our focus to the texts themselves. How do we actually read the ancient biblical texts that recorded these very events? We have to look through a meta-lens of literary and theological analysis. To explain this, think about an analogy from American history. Picture Emanuel Lutz's famous 1851 painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware. I want you to ask yourself, is literal history being depicted there?
Let's break it down. In that heroic depiction, Washington is standing triumphantly on the edge of a rowboat, surrounded by icebergs, which, by the way, is a terrible idea if you've ever been in a small boat. There are horses in the boats behind him. Someone is holding an American flag that Betsy Ross hasn't even stitched yet. The crew is a perfectly diverse microcosm of America. But the historical reality? It was a pitch-black night, freezing cold, incredibly chaotic, and it was a surprise attack. You literally couldn't see a thing.
So, does the painting's lack of literal accuracy mean the crossing didn't happen? Of course not. It was a real event. But the artist purposefully altered the facts to convey a richer symbolic message of hope and unity for deeply divided 19th century America. And honestly, this is exactly how we have to approach ancient biblical texts. History informs the story, rather than the story informing the history. The ancient writers used real historical occurrences, like a Bronze Age collapse or a massive settlement explosion, as the framework to tell complex, layered, theological stories about God and humanity. This framework is especially vital when dealing with what scholars call texts of terror, those incredibly violent accounts of conquest. Dr. Greer outlines a really helpful academic approach here. Step 1, be bothered. We absolutely must acknowledge the deep moral tension these ancient warfare stories create. Step 2 is genre analysis. We have to recognize that ancient Near Eastern warfare accounts heavily utilized a hyperbolic, exaggerated literary style. Kings constantly boasted they destroyed everything, even when they absolutely didn't. And step 3, proceed with extreme caution before drawing any definitive historical or theological conclusions from these super complex narratives.
When we put all these puzzle pieces together, a really vivid picture emerges. As Dr. Greer notes, Israel is one of these fledgling kingdoms that rises out of the ashes of the late Bronze Age collapse. Early Israel emerged in a highly specific time and place, leaving a tangible, undeniable footprint in the dirt that provides the historical bedrock for the grand, narrative-driven texts of the Bible.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to ponder. If we demand that ancient writers deliver history exactly like a modern textbook, aren't we just engaging in historical arrogance? Are we missing the much deeper meaning of these stories by judging them strictly through our own modern lens? The challenge for us is to read ancient texts on their own terms, inviting us to rethink what truth really meant in the ancient world. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the evidence, and I'll catch you next time.